This module considers how Gospel writers acquired information about Jesus. Scholars agree that Jesus died around 30 of the Common Era, and that the first Gospel to be written was the Gospel of Mark, which was penned between the years 65 and 70 of the Common Era. Matthew and Luke are usually dated to 80 to 85 of the Common Era, and the Gospel of John about 10 years after that. The earliest accounts of Jesus' life, ministry, and death, then, were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus was crucified. During those 35 to 65 years, stories about Jesus circulated orally throughout the Roman Empire. Since most missionary activity was aimed at individuals, stories about Jesus probably were told in order to underscore the benefits of conversion. Jesus could heal, exorcise demons, provide food to those with faith, and those who converted told stories to other people. It is unlikely that eyewitnesses were the only ones who were telling stories about Jesus, since there was such a wide geographic spread of Christianity throughout the empire. And we need to remind ourselves that the Apostle Paul, who is responsible for most of the literature that we find in the New Testament, was not an eyewitness follower of Jesus. So most likely stories about Jesus circulated by individuals who had heard stories from other individuals, who had heard stories from other individuals, and so forth. The stories were passed on by word of mouth, and they changed according to the circumstances and needs of the potential converts. Such changes or creations should not be attributed necessarily to deception or malice. Rather, the stories recounted what was true for the storyteller to tell about Jesus, what was significant. What was remembered, what was passed on, was not everything that could have been told about Jesus, but rather what individuals within early Christian communities found significant to tell about Jesus and to elaborate on as they explained the significance of Jesus. The authors of the Gospels were not eyewitnesses to Jesus' life and ministry. They used inherited traditions, not their own recollection of events, to tell stories about Jesus. Some of those traditions were probably historically accurate. Others were certainly embellished or even wholly created. In addition, the Gospel writers continued to modify and invent stories to underscore their own beliefs about Jesus. The creation of stories is made evident by variations in the Gospel narratives, such as the different timing of Jesus' death in the Gospel of Mark when compared to the Gospel of John. So I'll go back to the point that I made just a second ago, and that is Christians told stories about Jesus not to preserve historically accurate records about his sayings and deeds, but to convey theological truths. Stories were told to convince potential converts that Jesus was the Son of God, whose death brought salvation into the world. That conclusion will shape our reading of the Gospels in the next 3 modules devoted to the Gospels. We will be asking, why did the Gospel writers tell their stories in a particular way? Why did they make the particular emphases that they did? What messages were the authors trying to convey? And when we look at the shape of that message, what does it suggest about the community for whom the author of the Gospel was writing? It is common among New Testament scholars to call the New Testament Gospels ancient biographies. Ancient biographies differ from modern biographies in significant ways. Ancient biographies, of course, rely heavily on oral sources, preferring them, in fact, to written sources. Ancient authors, moreover, did not work with theories of psychological development. Important characteristics were present and recognized about an individual from birth. Stories were told to illustrate ethical and moral qualities that were manifested early on in an individual's life from the beginning, and which continued to be present and to exhibit themselves without change throughout a person's life. Sometime in the late 2nd century, early Christians claimed that 2 of the Gospels had been written by disciples, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John. When we get to those 2 Gospels next week, I'll suggest why those associations with disciples came to be made. 2 of the other Gospels, the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, were said to be written by companions or associates of the apostles. In the case of Luke, an associate of the apostles, written a generation or so later. Most scholars doubt the historicity of those traditions linking the Gospels either to direct apostolic authorship or to an association with apostles. It's important to recognize that none of the Gospel writers claims to have been an eyewitness. The Gospel writers mask their identity to a considerable degree. We also have to take into account that the original followers of Jesus, the 12 disciples, were likely uneducated peasants without writing skills. And as uneducated peasants without writing skills, we also have to recognize that Jesus' followers, the early disciples, spoke Aramaic. But the native language of all of the Gospel writers seems to have been Greek. And in the case of a couple of Gospel writers, but most especially the author of the Gospel of Luke, they are writers who write in very educated, highly sophisticated Greek. So those are some of the considerations we'll be taking into account in this module for Thursday as we begin to turn our attention toward a specific study of the Gospels, starting on Friday with the Gospel of Mark.